There comes a quiet moment in the evolution of the self when the storm no longer finds a harbor within you. Where once you were tossed by every wave of offense, every gust of criticism, every tremor of insecurity, now you remain anchored. It is not that the winds have ceased. It is that something deeper within you has awakened. You no longer react, you respond. Reaction is the reflex of the unconscious. It is the voice of the unintegrated shadow, quick, automatic, often venomous. It speaks before you know what you're saying, acts before you know what you're doing. It is the ancestral wound replaying itself through your nervous system. To react is to be possessed, not by spirits, but by fragments of yourself that you have yet to meet. But to respond is different. To respond is to stand at the gateway between instinct and awareness. It is to pause and breathe at the altar of discernment. It is the sacred space between stimulus and choice. Where reaction seeks to defend the ego, response seeks to understand the soul. It asks, what am I really feeling? What is this moment showing me about myself? Is this emotion truly about now? Or is it a ghost from the past wearing a new face? You begin to notice that anger is not always anger. It is grief in armor. That jealousy is not malice. It is longing unmet. That anxiety is not weakness. It is vigilance born from a time when you had to survive what you could not name. You do not fight these messengers anymore. You listen. You open the door to them as guests, not enemies. There is a radical shift in power here. You become the observer, not the actor in the drama of your past. You hear the rising tide within your chest, but you no longer drown. You feel the heat of confrontation, but you no longer burn. You sense the urge to speak sharply, to defend, to withdraw, but now you choose. And in that choice, a new self is born, one that is no longer at the mercy of its shadow, but in quiet relationship with it. You realize that silence is not submission, it is strength under command, that a soft voice does not mean fear, it means precision. That walking away is not avoidance, it is alignment. You no longer need to dominate a room to feel seen, nor win every argument to feel valid. You are no longer proving. You are no longer performing. You are no longer bleeding from the invisible cuts of yesterday, reopening them every time someone touches your pride. There was a time when you ran from it. You called it weakness, failure, shame. You kept it buried beneath forced smiles, beneath the mask of competence, beneath the endless doing that kept you from feeling. This thing, the shadow, was the exile within, the banished self, the child you punished, the voice you silenced, the anger you feared, the need you judged. And so, for years, you lived half alive, light above, chaos below, but now something is different. You no longer suppress the dark, you sit with it. The parts of you that once whispered from the corners now walk beside you. The envy, the guilt, the lust, the rage. You do not feed them, but you do not chain them either. You do not drown them in noise or bury them in routine. You listen, and in listening, you discover something extraordinary. These forces are not evil. They are wounded, they are distorted, yes, but not wicked. They were born in pain, shaped in confusion, hardened by abandonment, but at their root they are energy, pure, potent, and misunderstood. Suppression is violence. It is a civil war of the psyche. It is the self turning against itself, trying to amputate its own history, but what is buried does not die. It festers, it leaks, it manipulates from below. It poisons thoughts, sabotages love, twists clarity into projection. The one who represses must control everything, because they live in fear of what might rise if the dam breaks. But something changed. You chose to descend, to enter the cave where you once feared you'd be devoured. And there you found not a monster, but a mirror. Now, when grief surfaces, you don't apologize for it. When anger visits, you do not clench your jaw and swallow it whole. When fear knocks, you do not pretend to be fearless. You welcome them like old travelers bearing messages. They come to tell you where you've been fractured, where your needs were denied, where your voice was lost. They come not to destroy, but to restore. You learn that embracing the dark does not mean indulging it. It means understanding it. You begin to trace the outlines of your wounds with compassion, not contempt. You speak to the younger self within you not with blame, but with reverence. You cradle the parts of you that were never held. You look into the eyes of your shadow and see not an enemy, but a twin long abandoned at the crossroads, and as you accept it, something loosens. The energy it once took to suppress now becomes power reclaimed. The very thing that once weighed you down becomes a root. You are no longer afraid of breaking because you have broken, and you are still here, stronger, deeper, quieter, whole. The darkness is no longer a prison. It is a womb, a forge, a teacher. You walk through your inner world now not as a fugitive, but as a sovereign. You do not divide yourself into what is worthy and what is not. You have learned that every part of you has a role in the architecture of your becoming. Even the wild, even the shadow, even the raw and unfinished edges that no one taught you to love. There was a time when the world outside you was the battlefield for the war inside you. You didn't know this then. You believed they were the problem, those people, those situations, those voices that irritated you, angered you, disturbed your peace. You called them toxic, selfish, arrogant, weak. But underneath the judgment lived a forgotten truth. You were looking into a mirror and mistaking it for a window. This is the ancient trick of the shadow. It hides in plain sight, on the faces of others. It is not content to live in silence, so it speaks through your reactions. What you cannot accept in yourself, you condemn in someone else. What you suppress, you accuse. What you disown, you fear. Projection is the shadow's defense. It keeps your deepest wounds outside of your conscious reach until you're strong enough to reclaim them. At first, you defend your projections as facts. You are convinced they are truly that inconsiderate, that controlling, that unworthy. You build entire identities around what others represent for you. But slowly, painfully, you begin to notice the patterns. The same stories repeat, the same emotions return, the same battles play out with different faces, and somewhere deep within, a voice you used to ignore whispers, "This isn't about them." Something in you begins to turn inward. You stop asking, "Why are they like this?" and begin to ask, "What in me is being reflected?" This is the turning point, the sacred reversal. You start to pull back the projections like veils one by one. The cruelty you saw in them, you find it in the way you speak to yourself when no one is listening. The arrogance, it mirrors your own buried hunger for recognition. The neediness you despised, a mirror of the tenderness you were once punished for showing. And here, in this intimate gaze, judgment gives way to understanding. You begin to integrate. Piece by piece, the fragments return to you, not to hurt you, but to make you whole. You stop dividing the world into good and bad, superior and inferior, acceptable and rejected. You no longer need enemies to hold what you're unwilling to see. The world is no longer your projection screen. It becomes your inner landscape in disguise. You begin to see the faces of others not as threats, but as messengers. Every difficult person becomes a doorway to the unloved corners of your psyche. Every conflict becomes a mirror. Every irritation a compass. The world stops being something you have to defend yourself from and becomes something you learn from. And in this learning, a strange kind of grace arises. You do not react with the same urgency. You do not collapse into blame. You do not race to exile your discomfort. You hold it, you trace it, you own it. You whisper to the shadow, "I see you now," and slowly it stops fighting you. It lays down its weapons and begins to trust that it no longer needs to hide. The self that emerges from this process is not pure, but integrated, not light without darkness, but light that has walked through darkness and returned wiser, deeper, more whole. The masks fall, the roles dissolve. And for the first time, you no longer need others to carry the burden of what you refused to face. There comes a subtle shift within the psyche, a moment unnoticed by the world but unmistakable to the soul, when the noise begins to fall away. Where there was once grasping, striving, resisting, now there is stillness. Not the stillness of numbness or resignation, but the stillness of one who has ceased to war against themselves. For so long, you were taught that life must be wrestled into shape. That worth must be earned through exhaustion. That meaning must be chased, hunted, forced into the shape of your expectations. You battled for identity, for love, for validation, as if everything sacred must be stolen from the hands of the universe. And so your days were filled with movement, often frantic, rarely conscious. You called it ambition, productivity, strength, but underneath it was fear, fear of being unseen, fear of insignificance, fear of the silence itself. You were conditioned to believe that if you stopped pushing, you would collapse, that if you let go, everything would fall apart, that rest was for the weak, and surrender was defeat. But the struggle was never with the world, it was with your own shadow. You were trying to outrun the very parts of you that longed to be understood, and in doing so, you drained your energy not in living, but in fleeing. But something ancient begins to awaken when the shadow no longer governs you. A different energy, a different pace. You begin to feel the presence of a quiet current beneath the surface, something steady, something timeless. It is not loud, but it is powerful. It does not shout, but it never leaves. It is the voice of the self that has no need to prove, no need to defend, no need to rush. Stillness is not stagnation. It is the return to your original rhythm, the one the world taught you to override. It is the remembering that your value is not measured by urgency, nor your purpose revealed through suffering. It is the sacred pause between breath and decision, where clarity emerges unforced, where choices are made not from fear, but from alignment. In this stillness, you begin to notice things you missed before, the shape of your thoughts, the undercurrent of your feelings, the subtle intuition that lives beneath logic. You realize how much of your past was not guided by intention, but by reaction. How much of your suffering came not from reality itself, but from the stories your shadow told you about it. And you begin, slowly, gently, to stop believing those stories. The struggle fades, not because life becomes easier, but because your resistance to it softens. You no longer fight the tide, you move with it, you trust its flow. You learn that not every mountain must be climbed, not every insult must be answered, not every ache must be cured. There is power in being unmoved, not because you are cold, but because you are rooted. You begin to observe the chaos of others without absorbing it. You feel pain without becoming it. You witness desire without being consumed by it. You hold space for contradiction, for mystery, for paradox. You find yourself at peace in situations that once shattered you. You do not rush to fix, to label, to control. You simply remain present, and in that presence, something deep and wordless begins to heal. You no longer need the world to reflect your value for you to feel it. You do not chase love, you embody it. You do not demand respect, you radiate it. You do not search for answers, you become the question itself. There is a fullness in this stillness, a quiet abundance, a sense that nothing is missing and nothing is wasted. Everything belongs, even the parts of you that once felt too broken to name.